The final seminar of this quarter. I'm very happy to welcome Alison Conway, who's a good colleague and a very good friend of mine. And we studied together. We did our PhD together at University of Texas at Austin. And she does a lot of work. I mean, she's going to talk about freight tricycles today, but she does a lot of work which is very relevant to the research we do here in terms of biking, pedestrian issues, and sustainable freight. So thank you, Alison.
Thanks, Javi. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today. What I'm going to talk to you about is a project we recently completed in New York City, examining the potential for increasing the use of cargo cycles for urban delivery. And so the presentation I'm going to go through will basically consist of 4 components. First, I'll just talk a little about the background and the motivation for the project and the approach that we took. Then the 2 major parts of the project were a state of the practice review and some case studies that we actually conducted in New York, and then I'll end with some lessons learned from the project. So first just starting from the project motivation and approach. My background, as Avi mentioned, is actually primarily in freight transportation. I've done a lot of work looking at long combination trucks and big vehicles. However, after relocating to New York City 6.5 years ago, New York is very rapidly expanding its bicycle network, very rapidly making changes for pedestrian safety. So the streets are changing rapidly. So my area now in which I do most of my work is really focusing on now what's happening with the interface between freight and those green non-motorized modes of transportation, and how can we find new solutions that keep efficient goods movement while also controlling for the externalities that arise from the interactions between those modes. So just some basics about freight in New York City. As in most cities, nearly all freight moves in the last mile by either truck or van. In Manhattan especially, parking is already inadequate. There have been a number of research studies that have already demonstrated that the demand for parking for freight is higher than the capacity that's already there to provide a place for those vehicles to park. At the same time, freight demand is changing very rapidly. So a couple of different trends are happening at the same time. First, on the traditional commercial goods movement side, both retailers and manufacturers over the last 2 decades have moved to just-in-time deliveries. What just-in-time deliveries means is that rather than stocking large excess capacity of goods at the retail store, the stores basically in real time order to fill their needs. So that means instead of having big, large shipments of things being delivered and stored, instead we have many smaller scale deliveries that are coming in to fill the needs of those retail stores. The same thing is happening on the personal side with e-commerce. No longer do we even go to retail stores to receive a lot of the things we need. I live in New York. I don't have a car. Most of the things I buy online. I get household goods delivered. I get food delivered. Everything comes by delivery. Many of those services, I can define a 2-hour window in which I want that delivery being made. So now we've got individuals, whereas residential households used to be rounding error in the amount of freight that was moving within a city, now are generating huge demands for these small deliveries that need to be made. So basically, we've got freight demand is getting bigger, and the complexity of that freight demand is also increasing, because rather than big shipments to a couple of places, we've got small shipments going absolutely everywhere. At the same time, the network on which these freight vehicles is operating is changing very rapidly. So in New York City, as I mentioned, since 2005, we've been making massive changes to the urban street network. Over 400 miles of bicycle lanes have been installed. We've installed 8 select bus corridors, so bus rapid transit, dedicated corridors for transit. More than 60 complete streets projects. What most of the complete streets projects, at least the most visible change you'll see, is it's shortening the pedestrian crossing distances. So we're extending out sidewalks at the corners, making very small turning radii, and narrow distances. Why is this an issue? Because trucks cannot navigate those turns. If it's a small turning radius, a truck cannot physically make it around that turn. So we're making the infrastructure less hospitable to trucks, reducing the capacity at the same time that these demands are increasing. That has implications not only for efficiency, but also for safety, because if we're increasing the number of pedestrians, or especially the number of cyclists on the road, and we've got the number of trucks increasing and the trucks are not operating on the capacity that they had previously, we've got at least the potential for increased accidents to occur between those modes. And that's accidents involving large vehicles and non-motorized travelers are disproportionately dangerous for the non-motorized travelers. So much higher rates of fatalities if there's a truck involved than a smaller vehicle. So because of these changes, we started to investigate one potential solution for urban freight, which is the use of cargo cycles for last mile delivery. What is a cargo cycle? First, I should point out that there's an evolving vocabulary for this mode of transportation. You'll hear the word cargo bike, cargo cycle, freight trike, freight bike. There's no single term. What I mean by a cargo cycle is a human-powered, or possibly human-powered with an electrical assist vehicle with cargo carrying capacity that's used for goods movement. So the approach that we took to understand the potential for this mode in New York City is, first, we did a state of the practice review, which is basically a literature review of all the research that's been done and published. We also did a survey of North American carriers. That was sort of to understand what's going on and what's the potential for these modes, this mode to be used within different markets. The second thing we did, and probably the more unique aspect of this research compared to research that came before it, is that we focused in on the traffic performance of these vehicles. So we wanted to understand goods moving by cargo bike. How did that compare with goods moving by motorized vehicle? So we actually conducted case studies with GPS data collection on 2 carriers in Manhattan. So I'll start with the quick summary of the state of the practice, what's been done before, and what we have found, at least in terms of North American operations and New York City specific operations compared to what's being done elsewhere in the world. I'm not going to go through each of these papers in detail, but my point in showing this literature review slide is that there is a growing amount of research looking at cargo cycles, although it's all been done very recently. If you look at the dates on these studies, the earliest one you see here is 2009, which was kind of an overview market study by the Transport for London, trying to understand the potential for using cargo bikes. Most of the work that has been done has focused in one of 2 areas. One, in understanding the broad market for use of cargo bikes. The Transport for London study is an example. Another example is in Germany right now. There's a huge study ongoing looking at how cargo bikes could be used in, for local package deliveries. The other focus of these studies has been on operational costs. So several of these case studies have looked at, if we replace truck operations or van operations with cargo bikes, what are the cost trade-offs in terms of vehicle costs, maintenance costs, labor costs, and how do those pan out? And I should point out that the only other US work I've seen published is here at Portland State. So because most of the literature is focused in Europe, especially back when we started this study in 2012, we conducted a survey of North American carriers, so urban operators. The one exception in not a particularly major city is one of our carriers was in Ames, Iowa, but the rest are in relatively large or medium to large size cities in New York and Boston area, in Toronto and Vancouver area, Salt Lake City, in Berkeley, California, and Franklin just walked in here in Portland, participated in our survey as well. So what did we find? First, in terms of the commodities that are actually moving by cargo cycle, we found that there's a fairly broad range of things that can move by cargo bike. The most popular in Europe is cargo bikes are actually used for last mile parcel delivery. So on the right side of the screen, you see the bike. This is from one of the operators in Paris. Many of the operators in Paris and in other major European cities like Brussels, London, they're actually working with carriers like TNT and DHL, who are major international parcel movers that use these vehicles for last mile delivery. Here in the US, we see somewhat of a different focus in the market. Here, I say B2B food deliveries are probably the biggest among the markets, the people that we talked to in the survey. So moving goods from small manufacturers of often specialized products to retailers who sell those products. There's also an uptick, I think, especially over the last 2 or 3 years in New York, in B2C retail deliveries. So many of the grocery stores in New York City now are using cargo bikes to make those deliveries of groceries directly to people's homes. So there is growth in that market, but generally B2B and B2C food deliveries are the primary market we see in North America. There are a few other examples, things like office supplies, recycling, composting that move as well. So based on our review of both North America and Europe, we've identified, just from the literature review, a number of benefits of cargo cycles. So kind of going through the list. Obviously, cargo cycles do not require as much fuel as a motorized vehicle would. The purchase cost of a cargo cycle is much lower than the cost of a truck. Maintenance costs generally are going to be lower. So the vehicle costs are generally going to go down. Second, driver health benefits. One of the major challenges in the trucking industry is that truckers have health issues from being sedentary all day. People who are actively operating cargo bikes are actually getting physical benefits out of operating these cargo bikes. So there's definite driver health benefits. One of the major benefits that the retailers, I guess, who use cargo bike services is that they can demonstrate their commitment to sustainability. One big difference that I kind of glossed over on the last slide is that in the US, especially in North America, most of the businesses that take advantage of cargo bike services are businesses that already have a green mindset. So, for example, one of the case studies I'll talk to you about in New York City is City Bakery. It's a small local green bakery. They move their goods between their own locations, but their whole business mindset is green. They use recycled countertops. They use organic products in their food. So the transportation becomes a part of the whole green worldview of the business. I would say in Europe, that's not as extreme, or it's not as common in that these larger operators are also starting to use these vehicles. Cargo bikes, when they are allowed to operate freely, are really flexible vehicles. So they can park on the sidewalk, they can park on the street, they can park almost anywhere, which is a huge advantage in urban operations, because if you're a truck, as I mentioned, especially in New York, there is not enough truck parking. So if there's no parking available, you either double park, in which case you end up with a really expensive parking fine, or you wait and then you waste a whole lot of time waiting for that parking space. And same thing with the actual routes on which you operate. And this is something we saw from Europe, that it can make a difference how the vehicles are actually regulated. The first 2 European studies that I mentioned were in Paris and London. Those 2 studies, the vehicles were actually exactly the same vehicle. The London operator actually purchased his vehicle from the French operator, so they were operating the same exact vehicles. In Paris, that vehicle is classified as a bicycle. It can operate anywhere that a bicycle can operate. So Paris has a lot of bus lanes in which bicycles are allowed to operate. So a huge part of their urban capacity is these dedicated lanes. The cargo bikes can take advantage of that. London, when they first started operating, because the bikes were equipped with an electric assist, they were actually not classified as a bicycle. They fell under a classification that basically put them with mopeds as a mode of transportation, meaning they cannot park on the sidewalk, they can only park on the street, they can only operate on motor vehicle capacity. And so the regulations that are in place can actually make a huge difference on whether or not this is a benefit. So that's for the operators. Why would cargo bikes operations be better? When we start talking about the urban areas, some of these are really obvious. If you have a human-powered vehicle, not a huge diesel-burning engine moving your goods, you're going to save a lot of CO2 emissions. You're going to save a lot of air pollutant emissions. You're going to have reduced noise impacts. Bikes are much quieter than trucks. And I think one that we really haven't paid a whole lot of attention to, but I think is increasingly important, especially in New York City, is that these vehicles are not inherently incompatible with non-motorized vehicles. So as we in New York, now you here in Portland, you probably have a different situation in that your infrastructure's been bike-friendly for longer. But in New York, really just within the last 10 years, have we been massively expanding our bike infrastructure and redesigning our streets for pedestrian safety, introducing this incompatibility that is something that needs to be resolved. So if we want streets to be safe for bikes and pedestrians, but we have trucks trying to operate on those streets that really aren't built for those truck operations, it's a huge new challenge. Okay, so that was all the good things about cargo bikes. Now, however, there are some real challenges that also need to be considered and things that can make cargo bike not the best solution for everyone. First, and I think most importantly, is that to really operate, have financial viability as a cargo bike operator, you need to have a dense market within a very small radius. So there's limitations on how far people can cycle. There's limitations on the loads that can be carried. So to move a high volume of goods, you need to have a very dense market. That sets up sort of this catch-22 situation in that where do dense markets exist? In the really expensive centers of the central business districts. So where you need to be operating in order to make your business viable is also where it's really expensive to have that space. So that's probably the biggest challenge to cargo bike operations. Second is if you're working with TNT or businesses like that where it's a last mile solution, there can be very high costs for transloading. So you need people who are going to unload from trucks or whatever vehicle comes in, sort the goods. You need space to do that, so those are high costs. Second biggest challenge is just economies of scale. If you have a very large vehicle moving a very large volume of goods and you are actually using all of the space on that vehicle, you are probably not going to move those goods more efficiently by moving them to a smaller vehicle because now you need more operators and things are going to get more expensive. However, there's a lot of freight operations that are not fully utilizing the capacity. And again, we'll talk about an example from our case studies. Driver costs in New York City, especially, I'm not sure what the regulations are here in Portland, but in New York, our cargo bike operators require the same workers' compensation insurance as bicycle messengers, and that's very expensive insurance, so it's expensive to insure the operators in New York. And as I mentioned, you need more operators when they're carrying smaller volumes of goods. Last, the kind of reason that a lot of the attempts at cargo bike operations have failed, especially in New York again, is just customer perception. People not taking bikes seriously as a mode of transportation. And again, this is definitely cultural. But there are people who just don't want to see their goods come in by bike because they don't think it's a serious mode of transportation. Although I think that's probably something that's changed even in New York and everywhere over the last couple of years. On the regulatory side, I've already mentioned this issue of what is this vehicle? Is it a bike? Is it a motor vehicle? What is it if there's an electric assist involved? So I've been talking a lot about Europe and North America. Before I move on, one thing I wanted to comment on is there are these stark differences in operations in North America versus Europe are for a number of reasons, one of which is probably the level of public involvement in getting cargo bikes and other last mile solutions implemented. In Europe, The EU has been funding all kinds of green last mile delivery studies for probably the last decade. These are not huge amounts of money, but small pilot studies that are done, maybe not to subsidize operations, but even just to study the operations and to quantify the CO2 emissions saved so that the operators can focus on operations with their own funds, and they have research funded by the public sector. In Europe, we see a lot more local recognition schemes. So recognition schemes mean you're certified as a green carrier. Now, there are a few examples here. I think Portland being one of the cities where there's things at the local government level where you can actually be certified, but that's not common in the US. That's more common in Europe. In Paris, the operators actually do receive subsidy from the government. The way that they receive subsidy from the government is they receive space. They call them urban logistics spaces that are reserved in central parts of the city that the bike operators pay the average cost of warehousing space for anywhere in the metropolitan area right in the heart of the city. So one operator, La Petite Reine, who's one of the first that operate it, they basically operate out of a garage across the street from the Louvre. They're in the garage right in the heart of Paris. And so Paris is probably the largest example, but a number of European cities are taking kind of proactive action to get these types of solutions implemented. The Europeans are also making things a lot more difficult for trucks. So you don't necessarily have to subsidize the bikes if you make it difficult for the trucks to operate. So things like flat-out bans on vehicles that are heavily polluting or over a certain size, congestion charges, low emission zones, all of these things make truck operations more expensive and motor vehicle operations more expensive, which mean that relatively bikes there is likely a cost differential, but it's reducing the cost differential that results from that economy of scale issue. Finally, I already talked about it, but in Paris, these vehicles are classified as a bicycle, and so they have flexible operations. In North America, we haven't seen a whole lot of research. Most of the research that has been done is kind of academic driven, so the studies have come out of UTCs and things like that. Our study did receive some funding from New York State, so we appreciate that funding. But overall, public sector investment in research on this has been much more limited. As I mentioned, there are ambiguous operating regulations. I don't know that I mentioned it already, but in New York, no one's really sure what this vehicle is. Is it a bike? Is it a motor vehicle? In New York State, I'll talk about it a little bit later, electric assist motors on all bicycles are banned. You cannot operate an electric bicycle in the state of New York. So these vehicles get caught up in that. So our cargo bike operators do not use electric assist. They're just completely human powered, which has some implications. I already mentioned the insurance issue. We don't have those types of bans on freight access. There's been limited financial direct investment from cities and limited recognition schemes. We do have, at the federal level, the EPA has the Smart Way program, which certifies carriers as green carriers, but that's really not for local operations. It's more for larger national scale carriers. So what does this mean? In Europe, because of these pilot studies, operators have faced lower risks. They have found higher credibility because of involvement of businesses like TNT and DHL. This is not looked at as a niche mode. If it's major freight carriers who are trying this out as a solution, that gives some credibility to it. And as I mentioned, just the freight costs are different due to the regulations that have been put in place, so that has resulted in a reduced cost differential between these modes. Okay, so that's what we know from the rest of the world and from operations so far. Now I'm just going to focus in and talk a little bit about our New York City case studies. We worked with 2 operators in New York City Bakery and City Harvest. I mentioned City Bakery is a green bakery. They have, basically, they make deliveries between their flagship location to 7 other locations, all in Midtown and downtown Manhattan. City Harvest is a local food rescue organization. So they accept deliveries from restaurants and retail stores of food that will be perishable and would just be wasted and bring it to local nonprofits who can actually use that food. These two operators have very different ways in which they use the trikes. On the City Bakery side, they are basically demand response operation. They start in the morning with a standard delivery tour. They make fixed deliveries to each location. Throughout the day, as those locations sell out of products, they call the flagship store, say we need more bread or whatever it is, and get deliveries on demand. Previously, these were done by van. Now they're done by 2 trikes. Those 2 trikes have 5 different drivers. Those drivers return to the base between deliveries and have an office where they are able to rest. And again, there's a lot more drivers than trikes. They generally operate in the morning, 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. City Harvest is very different. They do very long tours. They start at about noon, so leftover breakfast items, then leftover lunch, then leftover dinner. They operate until midnight, 12-hour shifts with a single driver. So that cyclist takes the bike out, operates all day, and then returns usually around midnight. They only use the trikes for donation pickups less than 50 pounds. So City Harvest also has a massive fleet of trucks. They have 19 trucks that operate out of a warehouse in Long Island City, Queens, from which they make much larger deliveries. Okay. So for these 2 operators, what we wanted to know is how do their vehicles actually move through the city, and what performance benefits might they have compared to motorized vehicles. So we equipped the trikes. This is a City Bakery trike with the GPS devices shown there. It's a very standard GPS, relatively inexpensive. We put them in an OtterBox, strapped it to the chassis underneath the box. We purposely chose this device to it was completely passive operation, so the drivers did not touch the devices. We basically went down twice a week and swapped the device with an identical one and collected data. So overall, we ended up with 53 unique days of data for City Bakery trikes, 40 days for City Harvest trikes, and 29 days for City Harvest trucks. So we also put the devices under the driver's seat on the City Harvest trucks. There are some issues with using GPS in urban areas. Urban canyons, we have a lot of tall buildings in Manhattan that can create satellite interference. What that ends up with in the data is drift points, so points that don't make sense, much far away from the path that the vehicle should be following. The device was pretty good for what we needed it for, but it did have limited battery and storage life, so we lost a little bit of data there. And the City Harvest trucks especially, but the trikes as well, we didn't get data every day because if the driver was sick for the trikes, the trike didn't go out, so we didn't collect that data. The trucks, the fleet that we tracked operates citywide, but we didn't want to know how it was performing in the Bronx or in Queens. We only wanted to know in the Manhattan area, in Midtown and downtown Manhattan, where the trikes are actually operating. So we only got 29 days of data for the trucks. Now, when we collected the data points, so these are the data points that we collect with the GPS device. However, because of those drift points, we really can't use that distance measure. So the main data points that we focused on was latitude, longitude, and spot speed. From that, we extracted essentially 4 performance measures. So I'm not going to go through, we have limited time today, I'm not going to go through all the detail and all the data processing, but these are just the basic flow charts for how we extracted those 4 measures. On my last slide, I'll include a link to the actual report if you have interest in the actual step-by-step GIS data processing. So we used a process combining GIS and Visual Basic, so going back and forth between the 2. First performance measure we looked at was corridor moving speed. Basically, we had all these spot speeds from all the vehicle types. we stripped out the data from the locations where the vehicles would be stopped. So basically, the corridor moving speed is the speed at which it moves between intersections. So we didn't want to account for the intersections themselves, just the speed at which it moves between the intersections. When using GPS data, we use median rather than mean as a measure of central tendency, because you end up, especially in urban operations or congested operations, with a lot of really, really small readings that when you take the inverse of to calculate the mean, it blows up the number, and basically it's not a very good estimate. So we use the median.
What was your distinction? I'm sorry. What was your distinction between avenue and street?
Okay, good question. So in New York City, and in Manhattan especially, the city is set up as a grid. We have avenues which run from north to south, and streets which run from east to west. In general, the avenues are much longer blocks, so the streets are short blocks with usually 1, maybe 2 lanes in each direction. The avenues are wider, usually 3, 4, maybe more lanes, often operating in one direction, with wider lanes and longer distances between the intersections. So we expect speeds to be higher on the avenues than on the streets. And we wanted to distinguish here because one thing we were really interested in is in New York, traffic progression on the avenues tends to be better than crosstown operations. So if you have to go from one side of the city to the other, it can be challenging. So we wanted to be able to distinguish those operations. Okay. So what you see on the right side of the screen is the speed distributions that we got for the 3 vehicle types. Now you'll notice that the city bakery trikes operate almost with a normal distribution. So we see a few extreme values at the high end and the low end, but for the most part, they are operating very reliably with this close to normal distribution. Now the City Harvest trucks and the City Harvest trikes, we see a lot more low speeds. How do we explain this? The trucks, I think we can pretty easily state that it's traffic congestion. The trucks are sitting in traffic congestion between intersections as well as at the intersections. The trikes are mostly immune from that because they can usually bypass traffic congestion between intersections. Now the City Harvest trikes, however, we see these low speeds. Why? The explanation that we are, through talking to the drivers and people familiar with the sector, that we can come up with is, one, they carry heavier loads than the City Harvest, the City Bakery trikes. They operate on long shifts with no breaks. And City Bakery are operating on demand. So it's their own stores are calling saying, we need this immediately, bring it to us. Whereas the business model in which City Harvest is operating is very different. There's less intense need for on-demand delivery. Now, a second thing that we wanted to look at was New York has been kind of carving up its infrastructure and dedicating space for specific uses. The map on the right, I'm sorry, don't think you can read the text, but that basically shows in Manhattan on the left and Brooklyn and Queens, the city has in blue the designated local truck route network. So if you are a truck operating in New York City and you are going either to an origin or a destination within the city, you must stay on these routes except to leave those routes to get to your very final destination. The bike routes are shown in green. The red is truck routes on which bicycle lanes have been installed. So we now have a fairly large amount of overlap between the truck and bicycle route networks. So we just ran a very simple difference of medians test, or actually difference of means test for the bike lanes and for the truck routes to understand how these types of infrastructure might influence the operations of these vehicle types. I will say that with the caveat that this is not a humongous amount of data. We have a single truck operator and 2 trikes from which we collected this data. But first, looking at the truck routes, an interesting finding is that every vehicle operates better on the truck routes than on the non-truck routes. This probably makes sense. The truck routes were designed on the major corridors that have wide space to navigate. So the truck routes overall, everyone operates better on the truck routes. When we focused in on the bike lanes, though, we got some interesting results, really mixed results. So the trikes, for 3 of the 4 road types, or road type operator combinations, we saw better operations on the streets with the bike lanes. However, for the city bakery trikes operating on crosstown operations, we actually did not see any benefit from the bike lanes. One definite possibility is that there's trucks obstructing those bike lanes or other vehicles obstructing those bike lanes, especially on the crosstown streets. But that's an issue that needs further investigation. One that I think is more interesting, definitely needs further investigation, though, is that the trucks operate slower on the streets with bicycle lanes in both types of streets, although one's not significant. But this begs to further investigation. If we see continued growth in the bicycle lane network, does that mean that cargo bikes are going to have more advantage in the future? What are the broader implications of this? And so that's something I think we need to look at a little bit more. Okay, so the second performance measure we looked at was travel time. Now, for the 2 different operators, we had to use different measures because for City Bakery, as I mentioned, there were basically 7 locations in which they were operating. We had a lot of data, so we had a lot of repeat trips that we could, point-to-point trips that we could study. For City Harvest, they have close to 200 locations where they may have been starting and ending in Manhattan. The data just really didn't support study of repeat trips between those locations. So instead, we broke down the data, the trips by neighborhood, so neighborhood to neighborhood trips, and developed a second measure, which was stop time to travel time ratio. So we don't really need to know the exact travel time, but we can look at how much of that travel time is spent in delay. And I'll talk about that on the next slide. But first, just in terms of City Bakery, the travel times, what we found is the travel times are really consistent. There's not a whole lot of variability in the travel times for any of these trips. The longest trips, we do see a little bit more variability in the travel times, but overall, very little variability. When we turn that figure around and estimated a speed, we do see a downward trend in the speed at which the vehicles move the longer the trips get, which is, again, what you would expect when you have an entirely human-powered vehicle. The longer the trip gets, the slower the driver is going to get by the time they get to the end of that trip, especially if they're carrying a relatively heavy load. I already explained the stop time to travel time delay ratio. For both operators, we calculated the ratio. What this tells us is the amount of time from origin to destination that they spent sitting in delay. So time spent not moving between the origin and the destination. For the City Bakery cargo bikes, the vast majority spent somewhere between 0 and 20% of their travel time not moving. What does that represent? It's sitting at intersections, hopefully waiting for the light to turn green. So 0 to 20%. When we look at City Harvest, the City Harvest trikes, again, we see more time spent not moving, but even comparing trike and truck operations, even with the slower speeds, we can see that the City Harvest trikes still spend on average, or if you look at those numbers, the majority spend between 0 and 30% of their time in delay. The trucks, it's much less consistent. So we see those higher values, some up to 70 to 80% spent actually not moving. So 80% of the travel time is sitting in delay. 20% is actually moving. Okay. So the third measure we looked at is stop duration. Now, we have to be a little careful trying to use these numbers to really say anything, because when you have deliveries via a large vehicle and deliveries via a small vehicle, and you try to compare the numbers, you really can't. They're not directly comparable. But what we could see looking at these different types of operations was that in typical operations, the stop times for trikes are really short. However, we also saw some really extreme high stop times. For the trucks, generally see longer, but still not very long delivery times. But what I want to focus in on is these extremely high values. Those would be impossible, or at least really expensive with a motorized vehicle. So if you have to park, if you're City Harvest and you're making a delivery to a nonprofit, and you have to spend 45 minutes finding the person at that nonprofit who can take your delivery, with the trike, you can just park it on the sidewalk and leave it there. If you were in a van, you're either double parked or you're paying a meter, and so there's going to be a higher cost associated with that. Okay, so last thing I know I'm running slow here, so I'm going to go through these quickly. The last two things we did was looked at what does the space consumption look like for operations compared to motor vehicles, and what do the emissions look like. For space consumption, we separated into moving and parked time. For emissions estimation, because we're dealing with human-powered vehicles, there's no emissions associated with the trike operations. So basically, what we did was we used the EPA's MOVES model to estimate emissions rates for the vehicle that it would have replaced. So overall, I'm just quickly go through one table from City Bakery. City Bakery, as I mentioned, previously used vans to make these operations. We calculated what's the relative space consumption savings and the relative emission savings if they replaced, or not relative emission savings because it's not relative to zero, but what are the savings if they replace the van operations with what they now have as the trike operations. The tables here show that there are savings. These required a lot of assumptions. We basically used median values for all the input performance measures, so we did a lot of sensitivity analysis. Ultimately, between 2.8 and 8 times more space consumed by the vans than by the bikes to make these same operations. On the emission side, the benchmark values are shown here. The range is from about 0.7 times these values to 2.3 times for the sensitivity analysis that we've done. So the most sensitive variable is the vehicle age, particularly for particulate matter emissions. If we're comparing to an old van compared to a 5-year-old van, we're going to have much less savings because the engines on the newer vans are better. So last, just to wrap up with some lessons learned. Summary of what we found. If we took our median speed savings and our median stop time delay and looked at the average travel time, total travel time by each mode, the City Bakery trike is faster than the City Harvest truck. Now, the City Harvest trike is slower, so again, it depends on the operations, but we found that the City Bakery trikes, on average, could move a mile faster than the City Harvest trucks. I've already discussed all of these things, so I'm not going to rehash them, but last thing on the observed truck speeds, this just shows for the 2 trike operators and the truck operators what the speeds look like. This is the truck speeds, so about 46% of truck speeds are below the median for one of the 2 trike operators. About 80% are within the range of the speeds at which the trikes are operating. So only about 20% of the speeds are actually moving faster than the trikes are capable of moving. So things in color are the things that we either reiterated or found new in this study compared to the previous studies. We again found benefits for infrastructure flexibility. The bikes, we observed, took shorter routes than the trucks. Sometimes it's because they went the wrong way for 1 block down a one-way street. Sometimes it's because they cut through a park. But if they're given that flexibility, they have a shorter distance. Again, we observed parking for the trucks. The truck parking times changed with the regulations. When the meters were turned off, trucks parked for a longer time. The regulations had very little influence on the trike operations. Normal speed distribution for those City Bakery trikes showed it's a reliable mode of transportation. We have road and parking space consumption major savings, and again, GHG and air pollution savings. On the challenges side, we did identify some new challenges. I wouldn't say this is common sense. There's lower speeds for the human-powered vehicle than the truck when it's not operating in congested operations. And there are human limitations. So the bikes got slower as the trips got longer. A couple things that our New York City operators identified inhospitable infrastructure. If you want to cross between Manhattan and Brooklyn with a cargo bike, you cannot do it, because after 9/11 they installed security bollards on the bridge that narrowed the bike lanes to less than 4 feet wide at certain points on the bridge. That's a challenge. Last, the electric assist issue in New York City, we cannot use electric assists. I know your operators here are able to use electric assists, and that increases the load that can actually be carried on these bikes. So these are major challenges. So with that, I just want to acknowledge many, many people who contributed to this study, both at City College, our public agencies who funded us, NYSERDA and New York State Department of Transportation, Revolution Rickshaws, which is they refer to themselves as the Penske of cargo trikes. They basically maintain and operate all the cargo bikes for many of the, or maintain and store and all different things for many of the operators in New York City. New York City Department of Transportation, the two agencies we talked about, and finally our survey participants. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
From Gabriel Russo, urban planning, from a policy standpoint, it seems like the benefits are variable. Environmental benefits, parking congestion, things like that. Are you aware of any municipalities or larger state or federal governments that are offering significant tax credits to incentivize distributors to use cycles?
Right. As of right now, in the U.S., I'm not aware of anything. And even in Europe, I'm not aware of tax incentives. As I mentioned, there's the subsidizing of the space is an issue, but in terms of tax incentives, that's something you hear discussed, but I'm not aware of anywhere that it's actually implemented.
Ben Baumgartner, Urban Planning. I was curious if during your case study there were any serious crashes or events, bike, trike, ped, trike, truck,
right.
Like that.
That is not something we were able to observe. The safety issue is a tough one with these vehicles because there's just not any significant data set that we can use to analyze it. I sort of mentioned it in terms of compatibility with pedestrian modes. We do expect that the severity of accidents would decrease with this mode compared to motorized vehicles, just because you're taking something really big and replacing it with something that has blind spots with something that doesn't have the blind spots and that's smaller. However, if you have more of these on the road, you're actually potentially increasing the mileage traveled in the CBD by freight vehicles. So exposure versus severity becomes an issue. Again, my feeling is that this would lead to a net safety improvement, but we just don't have the data to back it up yet.
I've heard that people who bike to work are happier than those who drive. I was just wondering if, you've got to speak to any of these operators and see, if they have preference or if they're able to drive a trike or a van or a
Yeah, it's not something we surveyed. Well, we didn't put it in our survey, but working with our operators in New York, we did detailed interviews with them. And that is something that we heard. The operators like operating these bikes. They're sort of out in the city and not just kind of passing everything by. They're in the middle of everything. And that is anecdotally something that we heard. Okay.
Parking. So when parking is unavailable, truck driver can double park or wait. So how does a truck driver wait? And I have the second question. So is it possible to reduce on-street passenger car parking and increase on-street truck parking?
Yeah, that's something I would like to see. New York has been actually doing a lot looking at truck parking issues. In Midtown Manhattan, within a certain area, it's basically all commercial meter parking. There is no passenger car parking on a lot of these streets. That's not citywide. That's only in Manhattan. And double parking in the Manhattan core is illegal. You cannot double park, even to make a delivery. Outside of the core, double parking is perfectly legal to make a quick delivery. So we did see differences I didn't go into it in detail because of time constraints, but we did see differences in how the trucks behaved in Midtown versus in other parts of the city.
So how does a truck driver wait for parking if he doesn't want to double park?
Right. Basically, he doesn't. In New York, that's a different study I'm working on, but the average costs, I just started mapping the costs for truck. It's thousands of dollars a month that trucks pay in parking fines, except for if you're special operators, like who will remain nameless, who negotiate basically fixed costs that they pay to the city annually, and they don't pay the parking tickets that they get. So,
Ian Clancy, transportation. One thing I was thinking about was the size of the cargo bikes in comparison to like bigger trucks. I mean, this probably depends on like the size of the business and how small or large it is. But is there any issue with having to hire like additional workers, like any issue with costs to operate more cargo bikes as opposed to like one truck, or is that offset by or the not having to pay for truck costs?
Right. So that's actually we did not specifically study the cost issues, but the evidence from the European operators has been mixed. Some of them, the study that was done in Brussels, the bikes it was way more expensive to operate the bikes than the trucks. The London operator basically broke even. They replaced what was probably already a very inefficient freight operation, which they were running 7 vans per day from Heathrow Airport into the central London, basically the financial district of London. And so they replaced that with one truck trip a day and then they have like a micro consolidation center and made their deliveries from that. They broke even on the cost. So in that case, yes, there's a labor increase for the number of drivers, but the vehicle savings and the fuel savings balanced it out. But it really depends on how efficient the truck operations were to begin with. If they were actually using the economies of scale of the vehicles, it may not be more efficient, especially for long distance operations. But it really depends. For our 2 examples, City Harvest, we really didn't try to get into the costs because basically what they told us is if they didn't have the bikes, they just wouldn't do those pickups. There was nothing to compare it to. It was, we just wouldn't do these pickups. The City Bakery, they weren't using the van capacity, so it was not any loss by replacing it with a smaller vehicle because they just weren't using the capacity.
So in the development study, was that a single larger carrier operator, and were they optimizing that route?
I don't know all the details. As far as I know, they were, but the study also involved some strange assumptions. Like, I think they didn't use, for some reason, they didn't use the full capacity of the bikes. So, and that's where it gets really hard to get, there are absolutely times when this will give you cost benefits, and there are absolutely times when it won't, but distinguishing one from the other, I would say. Yes, so this is, it was in TNT in Brussels. They basically drove a truck into the middle of the city and used the truck as the mobile depot, they called it, and they operated the bikes from that mobile depot. But the cost was for where to park the truck. So again, it comes back to this space issue.
You might have mentioned this already. Are there any examples of infrastructure on the streets that is just for cargo bikes, like a bike lane only for cargo bikes, or right turn except cargo bikes can go through, things like that?
I don't know of anywhere that's happening. Like I said, in New York, actually, we are in sort of a gray area because New York actually has very strict regulations on pedicabs, and pedicabs are banned from using the bike infrastructure. So pedicabs are actually not permitted on the bike infrastructure. The cargo bikes, do not, by the letter of the law, are not classified as a pedicab. And I think, as of now, there's probably so few of them that anyone's thinking about it. And with pedicab regulations, it's the same thing. We did a study on pedicab regulations. Pedicab regulations are reflexive to incidents that happen. Nobody cared about pedicabs, except maybe the taxi industry that was competing with them, until a couple of severe accidents happened, at which time they started regulating pedicabs. And I think on the cargo bike side, there's in at least in New York and in many cities, there's just not enough of them to be impacting the network enough that there's regulations. Yeah.
Concerning the case study, were the drivers aware the entire time that they were being tracked? Do you believe that had an effect on the data? And if you were to do this again, do you think better data could be gleaned with like minimal operational input, like just an onboard computer or something like that, an app they could check in on their phone?
Yeah. So they were aware that the operations managers were aware. I'm not actually sure if all of the drivers, particularly on the trucks, were aware that the devices were on there. I do not think that it probably had much, if any, effect on what they were doing. We definitely, with a little bit more resources to collect the data, could have more efficiently collected the data. And I think it's maybe not on the cargo bike side, but on the truck side, there's a lot of other options now in terms of getting network-level GPS data to understand how the trucks are moving, not just from a single carrier. But so, yeah, short answer is I think they knew, but we're not 100% sure, and I don't expect that it had much of an impact on the data collected. Anything else? Sure.
So you have speed differential between trucks and bikes and cargo bikes. Do you have speed differential between cargo bikes and regular bikes?
So we did not collect data from any bikes. We overall do not have very good bike data in New York. We don't have, I know a lot of cities have implemented, like, I'm blanking on the name of it, and started in San Francisco, the app, basically phone-based apps that are operating now in a lot of cities, many different apps, but I think that's one, that's the one, the original one. I'm just totally blanking on the name, sorry. Yeah, CycleTrax, thank you. CycleTrax was the original one. So getting user kind of crowdsourced data to collect bike information, unfortunately, we don't have that in New York. Right, and that is a fear that I didn't mention on, if cargo bikes are operating slow and they are obstructing the bike infrastructure, and I think that's why the pedicabs, well, at least partially why the pedicabs do not operate on the bike infrastructure. Again, I think it comes back to the issue of there just aren't that many of them operating, that it's having a significant network impact. But that is a concern once you get more of them on the road. Yeah.
We have a few questions. A few viewers online about the same question: why New York bans the electric assisted
Right. I think the origin of the law is we have a lot of food delivery operators who operate the wrong way down one-way streets in the wrong direction with no lights on at night and just are dangerous operators. And these vehicles are getting caught up in that law. Now, that is what the law says. There are many electric bikes operating on the streets of New York City, although I recently, just last week, read that they were actually cracking down in some neighborhoods on these electric delivery bikes. But in my mind, this cargo cycle is a very different thing than those bicycles that are operating at high speeds in kind of with poor safety standards. But I think that's the origin of this law. And probably for the last decade, it goes up to the New York State Legislature to be overturned. It always passes the Assembly, which is the lower house of the legislature, and then the bill just gets caught up. I don't even think it ever it doesn't make it out of committee at the higher level. I don't know specifically who's keeping it from passing, but there's been a lot of interest on the legislative side of getting that overturned, but they haven't done it yet.
Just as a continuation of that question, I'm Bill Stites. We build truck trikes, cargo trikes here in Portland. So I'm wondering about just the nuance of the electric law, the electric assist law, in as much as I've heard a number of interpretations where if you basically create a pedelec such that pedaling needs to be occurring right before you can engage the electric. So I don't know, is there any update on that as far as whether that may be present?
And I think that we may see a distinction. I've heard, I'm not an expert on the topic, but I've heard if that distinction can be made, I think it's quite possible that the vehicles that require, it's really a pedal assist, not a, it can't be operated without pedaling. I think we may see that distinction. I would not be surprised if whatever regulation gets overturned focuses on that first. But I don't see it in play yet.
It seems like Amazon deliveries and just people having deliveries to their house is a big driver of the increase in trucks. I'm wondering if there's been any sort of, not necessarily policies, but any ways of trying to reduce that demand?
Yeah. On the public sector side, there hasn't been a whole lot. On the private sector side, they are trying to optimize their own deliveries because UPS doesn't want to make 5,000 stops in one neighborhood either. So you're seeing things like neighborhood collection points, like they drop off your package at the 7-Eleven instead of at your apartment, or lockers that they put Amazon lockers. So there are a lot of strategies that are being tried for alternative solutions, because the other thing with home delivery is there's very high failure rates. So often the truck from FedEx that's bringing your package, if you're not home, it fails and they have to do it again. So they're looking for alternatives to reduce that as well. So I would say, unfortunately, it's not something on the public policy side that has been on the radar, although I think it's probably coming because, like in New York right now, there's unrelated issue, but there's fighting over whether Uber is causing the traffic congestion in the city. And when that fight came up, people started talking about, well, maybe Uber is causing congestion, but so are the UPS trucks. So I think it's probably it's something that there isn't any active public policy. The private sector is trying to optimize their own operations and has come up with a lot of strategies for these alternative deliveries.
What's next?
So I guess we'd like to see larger scale implementations. I think the purpose of this study was really for two things. We wanted to help to demonstrate to the private sector that this is a legitimate mode of transportation and that you can actually move things faster if for the right type of deliveries. If you're in a dense urban area, this mode really does provide a competitive mode of transportation. On the public sector side, I think what we wanted to demonstrate is to just try to quantify these savings in terms of space and in terms of GHG emissions. This, we are hoping, would be a pilot study that would ultimately lead to help us to make the case for implementation of something like an urban consolidation center that would actually require input from either public sector partners. It would require both public and private sector participants to try to move forward with these types of strategies. Okay.
I would like to thank Alison for traveling all the way from East Coast and giving us a wonderful talk. Thank you.